Hi, this is Professor Kahan Lust, and welcome again to History 1301, United States History to 1877. Today's lecture is Lecture 13, The Development of American Democracy. Now, democracy is something that we take for granted in the United States today. It's something, however, that did not come about easily. It's something that, despite conventional wisdom, is actually a relatively new phenomena. It was accompanied by struggle, it was accompanied by strife, sometimes combat, sometimes conflict. At the very start of the United States' Republican history, small r, Republican history, the right to vote was restricted in this country. It was restricted to male property owning whites. There was no assumption that everyone should vote, nor that all should be able to participate. The thought was is that only those who had a stake in society, a vested interest in the outcome, should have a role to play. The new Constitution sought to ensure centralized power, and certainly that meant the limiting of the power of the people. It was going to be centralized or concentrated in the hands of the elites. But all of this began to change fairly quickly after the adoption of the Constitution. Rhode Islanders nearly had a civil war over the issue. Louisianans came to blows over who should have the right to vote and who should not have the right to vote. And South Carolina ultimately became the first state to change their constitution as a consequence of these arguments about who should be allowed to vote, who shouldn't be allowed to vote, enabling a greater sense of democracy, quote unquote, for all. Now, even though South Carolina does that, it's still a very limited definition of, quote, for all. It still had to be white and male, but property owning restrictions were removed in places like South Carolina. Now, our country is frequently looked at as a model for democracy, but again, we don't really see that as a modern thing. We don't see that even throughout much of American history. In 1800, for example, a very hotly contested election we dealt with in lecture, I think, 10. Only about 30% of all eligible voters actually voted. So that's not registered voters. That's 30% of all who were actually able to vote actually voted. In 1824, only about 10% of people who were eligible to vote actually did go out and vote. But by the 1830s and 40s, that number is actually skyrocketing. It's actually up to about 80%. Now, if we compare that to today, today only about 50% of registered voters actually go out and vote typically in our elections, which means it's really only about 25% of eligible voters. So we're actually down to, you know, 1800 levels. And it's even worse. Those are in presidential years. In local elections, for example, in mayoral elections, when there's no corresponding national election, we see that the voter turnout is right around 10% of the eligible voting turnout. Now, why this is important is why these numbers matter, I should say, rather not why they're important, but why these numbers matter is why a lot of people think, why should I even bother voting? Is because a lot of the things that we think of as issues for the populace to actually vote on, these are the most important things that affect the day to day lives of people, they're simply not subject to popular assent. Things like banking policy in this country. Sure, we elect representatives to handle that, but the representatives don't put that out as a sort of national referendum and say, what do you, the people, think? They don't do this on economic policy. They don't do it on trade issues. We don't do it on in terms of sending soldiers to war, terms of who decides where jobs are created under what circumstances. Those really don't get made through popular assent. So there's a number of reasons why people look at this and say we don't vote or we don't feel a need to vote. The core issues are not decided by us. But between 1820 and 1840, we do see a sort of political revolution, if you will, in the United States as things are going to start changing. For example, property holding qualifications for voting are removed nationwide, as well as for office holding. Voice voting winds up getting eliminated in the United States. Voice voting was literally you'd have an election, the person who was the election commissioner, or whatever title it was designated at the local level, would say, okay, here are the people who are voting in this election. John Smith, stand up and tell us who you're voting for. And John Smith would stand up and declare in front of everybody, this is who I'm voting for. So that sort of system winds up slowly getting eliminated. And then we also see the development of a new two-party system happening in this same era, where we have this confluence of the Second Great Awakening, where we have all of these political changes and social changes courtesy of the post-war of 1812 era. We see a political revolution here as well, with the development of a new two-party system. Remember, the first two-party system was the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Well, now the Democratic Republicans are, for all practical purposes, gone. They are going to go by the wayside, and that system, the two-party system, is going to be replaced with a new system with a Democratic Party developing and the Whig Party. And this Democratic Party that exists, that gets reconstituted here, is the same Democratic Party that exists to this day. The high point, if you will, of this new system was the election of 1840. It was one of the most colorful and entertaining and dirtiest elections in American history. The Whig Party would nominate a man named William Henry Harrison, who was pretty much only well known for putting down Indians. His opponent was Martin Van Buren, the incumbent president. He was nominated by the Democratic Party. William Henry Harrison was the first presidential candidate who really sort of created an image about himself, and implemented that image, and his campaign adopted that image and used it throughout the campaign. Harrison, though, while he takes on this image of the log cabin, which suggests that he was a sort of traditional, pulled himself up from the bootstraps type of common man, he adopts this as a way to win elections, win votes, but really he's playing a role here. Harrison was college educated, which was a big deal in this particular era. There just were not that many people who were college educated. His family was incredibly wealthy. They had to have some money to send him to college, but he had grown up on a plantation, and then by the time he reached adulthood, he himself owned more than 200 slaves. But he was calling himself the log cabin candidate as a way to appropriate an image of that he's in it with everybody else, that he's got the same background, the same values as every sort of common person in this country. And when I say his supporters adopted this image for him, it's not just pewter mugs and pins like we saw on the last slide. They produced log cabin shaped floats for parades. There were log cabin shaped whiskey bottles, log cabin shaped hats that their supporters wore. So these people were really running this idea that William Henry Harrison was a common man. To try to draw these people in and kind of make a connection with them, the Harrison campaign also sponsored these massive barbecues that were run as sort of campaign events. And it was at one of these, just listen to how big this one had to have been. The barbecue itself had 360 hams that they served to people and went through 4,500 pies to feed all these people. What was inferred in all of this, again, is that he is running as a candidate, quote, of the people. Now, when asked what he stood for, Harrison was coached to say nothing. He was not supposed to take a position on the major issues of the day. He was simply supposed to run on his past. He was supposed to say things like, well, you know, I fought Indians in the frontier, and this taught me to be flexible in my approach. So don't let yourself get pinned down, was the order of the day. And it created a precedent for future office seekers. Rely on your past and give no indication of what you actually believe, what you're really going to do. Now, in this election, Harrison wins a huge victory. 80% of the voting populace, eligible voters, actually cast ballots, And Harrison, the Whig, the opposition party, won overwhelmingly. So there's an important lesson in all of this. Again, to future office seekers, the important lesson is the emphasis on symbolism rather than substance, because substance has a tendency to alienate people. Something else also happened in this election. Harrison was very stubborn and gave a 3-hour long inaugural address in a pouring rainstorm. It was not only raining at the time, but because of the temperature, it was literally freezing at that point. And Harrison contracted pneumonia almost immediately, and then wound up dying 33 days into his presidency. So, and why this had a huge effect, in an effort to try to broaden his appeal to the largest number of voters, Harrison, a member of the Whig Party, remember, had actually chosen a Democrat, a guy named John Tyler, as his running mate. So, even though the Democrats had nominated somebody else and lost the election, when Harrison dies and a Democrat takes over the presidency, it turns out the Democrats got what they wanted anyway. So, a major precedent for electoral politics. Now, prior to the 1820s, there were a lot of restrictions on voting. Among the restrictions, you had to be a property owner. Plain and simple. You could not vote virtually anywhere without owning some property. The exceptions were places like South Carolina, where there was simply a ton of merchant trading going on. There were a lot of people who rented in Charleston, South Carolina, as opposed to owning property, because they had no intention of staying there year round. But the bulk of the year, they lived in Charleston, and they did their business through Charleston. And these people argued that to say, I don't have a stake in the outcome of elections in Charleston or in South Carolina is silly, because I've got a significant amount of money at stake. So what South Carolina does is they change their constitution so that it reflects that a person needed to own a certain amount of property or have a certain level of a quote-unquote estate, essentially meaning they had to have a certain amount of money in order to vote. But generally speaking, you had to own property, you had to have a stake in society, and you either had to be a church member, or, as it was in places like Massachusetts, you had to not be a member of the wrong church. For people in Massachusetts, they said, we don't care what religion you are as long as you're not Catholic. If you're not Catholic, you can vote, but if you're Catholic, you can't vote. So it was either be a church member, or at least not a member of the wrong church. But in state after state after state, starting in the 1820s, we see a move toward what was called universal white manhood suffrage. Universal white manhood suffrage. And here's how universal white manhood suffrage works. First of all, universal, it means all. White, manhood, men, suffrage, the ability to vote. So universal white manhood suffrage means all white males, adult white males, are allowed to vote. So why do they do this? Why do they set this as the benchmark? In some states, property ownership meant that, at least in theory, black people could vote. New York, for example, identified this as a, quote, problem of their elections. They knew that they had lots of African Americans who owned property, and by virtue of the state laws in that place, people who were of African descent who owned property could vote. But New Yorkers didn't like this, and what they tried to do first was they tried to actually increase the amounts of property owning required for somebody to vote. But what they found is that when they increased that amount of property, it got rid of a large number of white voters. It did what it was supposed to do in terms of getting rid of a number of black voters, but it also got rid of a lot of white voters. And that didn't make sense to these people. Now, to be clear about this, in every way, this is a racialist policy. They don't want to lose white votes. They only want to get rid of black votes. So ultimately, they came to the conclusion that the only way to eliminate these black votes without losing white votes is to simply remove any sort of nuance from the whole process. And simply they eliminate the property holding requirement and replace it with a racial stipulation that only white people can vote. So, universal white manhood suffrage is the stipulation. And this becomes the norm in virtually every single state. Now, these people, because they are actually opening up the process, they're going to be able to call this with a straight face. They're going to be able to call it a democratizing effort. And the reason I say it opens up the process, once they've eliminated property owning requirements, even the poorest white person can vote. So now more white people than ever are actually voting. Now, it obviously eliminates the black votership in the state of New York. So there is some hypocrisy again in calling this a democratization, but it is actually democratizing, even if it's just a limited democratization. So that's one change. Another huge change, a huge implementation here, is the elimination of voice voting. Early in American history, there was no concept of a private or secret ballot, and people who were voting didn't even have a choice in the matter. It was simply the way it was going to be. People knew how you voted, it was the norm, and you can probably figure out that if people know how you're voting, you're going to stand up and say, this is who I'm voting for president, this is who I vote for House of Representatives in our district, and then on down the line through local elections. People knew how you voted, and they could hold it against you as well. Eventually, there becomes agitation for a private voting system so that there's some secrecy to it. But real secret balloting doesn't actually get accomplished until the 1870s. So it's still a very long way in the offing at this moment. But there is some semblance of privacy by eliminating the voice voting requirement. Now, why this is happening is these are all a larger assault on the idea of privilege within the realm of politics. And what I mean by privilege is this idea of the politics of deference. Now, I've talked about the politics of deference in an earlier lecture in this semester. This idea, excuse me, that people defer to their social betters. They defer to the wealthy. They defer to lawyers. They defer to manufacturers. They defer to financiers. They defer to planters if it's in the South, because these people have a greater stake in society. So theoretically, they know better than everybody else. But there's a movement, just like there was during the post-Revolutionary War era, to move away from deference. There's an idea here in this era, the 1820s, also to move away from deference. There's a movement, for example, to eliminate professional qualifications for the legal profession, for the medical profession. The thought is that this should simply be a marketplace decision, that rather than having to go to law school or what they called, quote, reading for the law, well, if it is reading for the law and it's mostly about understanding precedent and understanding case law, you don't need to go to a special school to read. If you can read, you should be able to figure this out. So if you hang out a shingle that says, I am Clayton Cahan Lust, lawyer extraordinaire, if people keep coming to me for representation, then it must mean I'm successful. If I'm bad at it, if I'm bad at my job, people will stop coming to me. Same thing with the medical profession. You've heard me talk earlier about how not very good doctors were. There's not much of a difference by the time the 1800s roll around in the medical profession. And most people looked at backwoods cures, what we would today call homeopathic methods for dealing with healthcare issues. And people looked at that and said, these people are just as good at curing people as quote unquote medical doctors. So why require people to actually go through some sort of specialized medical training? Again, hang a shingle out that says you're Dr. Quinn medicine woman. And if you can cure people and people keep coming back to you for their cures, Well, it must mean that you're successful at it. So we're going to let the market, rather than any sort of specialized privilege, dictate who can actually do this. Now, when this is happening in these professional realms, we see this also having an associated change in the political arena. We see people starting to talk about common sense and using common sense language in referring to the electoral process. Before this move against deference, men who were going for office were said to, quote, stand for election because running was something that a gentleman simply didn't do. It was too much like work. And you don't want people who are not gentlemen in the realm of politics, except during this era, people are starting to go, well, why do we need gentlemen? So they start saying, no, these people are running for office. The idea of pleading for votes was considered to be unseemly. But now, these people who are running for election, no, they have to appeal to a broader electorate. So it's going to mean that they have to promise certain things to certain people in order to get elected. So after this democratizing process, we see people running for election, and we see the development of what we would today refer to as special interest politics. Something else that's developing is a new style of politics that's pioneered by a new political party, excuse me, called the Anti-Mason Party. Now, the Masons are a fraternal lodge, and the Anti-Masons, as their name should suggest to you, appeared, and they started appearing as an opposition to the Masonic groups. In 1826, a Mason named William Morgan published a book which he claimed would, quote, reveal the secrets of Freemasonry. It was literally titled Illustrations of Freemasonry. And he says in this book, I'm going to tell you all about the Masons. I'm going to tell you about their rituals. I'm going to tell you about their initiation. I'm going to tell you about their, quote, secrets. But as a Mason, Morgan had actually taken a pledge of silence and a pledge of secrecy about these things. Now, just prior to the release of Morgan's book, Morgan was kidnapped and thrown over Niagara Falls. And people were angry about this. They were outraged that he was very obviously murdered. And then when the investigation concluded that there was nobody to punish, and the police actually dragged their feet on this, people began arguing that a conspiracy actually existed around the killing of William Morgan, obviously, but it was a much broader conspiracy. And the conspiracy was essentially this, that the Masons controlled the government and business across the country and wound up having Morgan killed. And here's their proof of their conspiracy. 23 of the governors in the United States at that time were Masons. Most of the presidents of the United States up to this point had actually been Masons, and many wealthy businessmen were also Masons. Now, what these people who were, quote, anti-Masons were arguing was that a small clique of people monopolized power and money in the United States, and it monopolized access to all of this. This whole idea, this whole set of notions stuck in the United States. And we today refer to this as the politics of paranoia. The politics of paranoia argue in various forms, whether it's Masons, whether it's Illuminati, whether it's lizard people, whatever. It's this idea that elites cut off opposition and monopolize access to power, to money, to the government, and everything. And the Anti-Mason Party got a lot of support in the 1820s for the same reason that a lot of conspiracy theorists get a lot of attention and support even today. Because it's easier to believe a conspiracy than to dig deeper and start looking into real root causes. The conspiracy seems, quote unquote, more reasonable, especially if you don't think about it too hard. So the anti-Masons used this sentiment to mobilize voters. They used this to mobilize voters because there was no real opposition party in the United States, and these people who felt disaffected within the political system wound up finding a home in the anti-Mason party. And ultimately, the anti-Mason party merged with other people who were disaffected, who didn't really want to go into this anti-Mason stuff, but they still felt that the political system didn't serve their needs. So what they wound up doing was borrowing a name from the English political tradition. In the English political tradition, the term for a quote opposition person was that they were a Whig. So these people in the United States simply adopted the same name. They said, we are the opposition party, therefore we will call ourselves the Whig Party, WHIG. Now, all of this stuff about opposition and all of this means we need to take a step back for a second to the so-called Hartford Convention that we talked about right after the War of 1812. In that Hartford Convention, recall that the Federalists had tried throughout the War of 1812 to restrict congressional power. They threatened to secede if their demands were not met. But while they were meeting in Hartford, the news about the Battle of New Orleans got to the East Coast, ended the War of 1812. The Federalists were perceived kind of as traitors, and they faded away. Nobody with any real substance was going to call themselves a Federalist because it was kind of a bad word. So after the War of 1812, and particularly after the Hartford Convention, the United States basically becomes a one-party nation. Now, when you have one political party, it's easy to slip into this idea that that's going to go on forever, that it's easy to contain dissent, and there will never, ever, ever, ever be an opposition party. But that's not what happens typically, and it's not what happened here either. The Republican Party, which was the last party standing in all of this, in that first party system, they began to divide and factionalize over three basic issues. Now, the first issue that causes them to sort of splinter is this crisis over slavery. East of the Mississippi River, there was a line called the Mason-Dixon line that separated slave territory from free territory. Everything north of that line was free territory. Everything south of that line was slave territory. But then there became questions about what happens in the West, especially with all that stuff about the Missouri Compromise. There was no slavery boundary until the Missouri Compromise. When the Missouri Compromise winds up settling all of this, you've got the 3630 line creating that line. But remember, it doesn't happen easily. There's a lot of dissent within Congress. There's a lot of anger over how this is going to be. And what became clear in all of this was that Northern Democratic Republicans were in control in the Congress. And Northern Democratic Republicans tended to be anti-slavery. And they outnumbered those pro-slavery people in the South. So, all these people in the South were convinced that they must have pro-slavery allies in the North. Now, I'm going to flip slides for a minute, but we'll come back to this one here in a second. What winds up happening in all of this is that those Northern people who favor slavery, they're going to coalesce into a party called the Democratic Party. They are going to be led by a guy named Martin Van Buren, and they are going to join with those pro-slavery Democratic Republicans from the South. So if you kind of look at this slide here, you've got a Democratic Republican Party in 1819 that is factionalizing. Okay, it's breaking up into it's not split, okay, but it's broken up into those two factions, a pro-slavery South and an anti-slavery North. But after 1819, you see the anti-slavery people in the North maintaining, hey, we are truly the Democratic Republicans. We are the heirs of all of this stuff. And then there's a new party, that Democratic Party, that winds up comprising the pro-slavery Northerners and the pro-slavery Democratic Republicans from the South. So it's a really strange split happening directly because of these questions about slavery. Now, the second question, the second issue that divides these two parties is the economic crisis that we talked about before, the Panic of 1819. There was incredibly high unemployment. There were lots of foreclosures across the country. The population in debtors' prison actually increased by 300%. Believe it or not, we used to throw people who owed debts, we used to throw them into jail. And this prison population increased by 300%. Now, the key question was, how do we get out of this economic decline? And businesses in this country, a lot of businessmen, especially manufacturers, argued that the answer here was the government ought to impose a high tariff. It will keep foreign manufactured goods out of the United States, force Americans to buy Americans, and it'll cause the recovery that we need in the economy. Now, debtors who were primarily from the South began demanding stay laws, even though it was obviously clear during this period that the Constitution prohibited the states from issuing stay laws. Debtors in the South were saying, fine, then the national government needs to issue these stay laws. So the Democratic Republican Party, again, factionalized into two sides, one that favored the use of high tariffs, another one that favored the use of stay laws. And they split almost exactly the same way they did on the other slide. The Northerners who favored the tariffs wound up going with the Democratic Republicans. The Southerners who were the pro-tariff, the pro-stay law faction wound up going with the pro-slavery Northerners and the pro-slavery Southerners in the Democratic Party. Now, the last issue, remember there's three issues that factionalize this group. The third issue is the election of 1824. Up until 1824, every single president of the United States, except John Adams, had come from Virginia. But in 1824, for the first time, it appeared that there was no chance anybody from Virginia, well, I take that back, there was nobody from Virginia running for president. So this was clearly going to be a different type of election just on that front. Now, the way candidates were chosen was through a congressional caucus. The congressional leaders would get together and say, here are the people that we think are the most viable presidential candidates, and we're presenting them to you, the people, to decide who you are going to vote for. Well, it's not terribly democratic, obviously, and virtually no one participated in it. Virtually everybody who was talking about running for president said, I don't care what the caucus actually says, I'm running for president whether they like it or not. I fit the requirements under the Constitution, so I'm running. I don't care what they say. Now, there's a very crowded field running for the presidency, and 5 contenders emerged pretty quickly. The 5 most viable candidates were the sitting Secretary of the Treasury under James Monroe, a guy named William Crawford. William Crawford got a lot of support. There were lots of people who looked at him and said, we're coming out of this economic crisis. We need somebody who understands the economy, and who better than the Secretary of the Treasury. He had the support of Thomas Jefferson, who was still alive at this point. Jefferson endorses him for the presidency. However, William Crawford also suffered a stroke, and by election day was blind and confined to his bed. And everybody looked at him and said, this guy may be eminently qualified, he may have Jefferson's endorsement, but there's no way we can vote for William Crawford. John C. Calhoun, a senator from South Carolina, actually had tons of support. He had been a member of the House of Representatives. He was a member of the Senate. He had just come off a very successful stint as the Secretary of War. And again, he had lots of experience, and people thought this is new blood. This is somebody who will revitalize the American identity in all of this. But ultimately, John C. Calhoun wound up accepting a position as running mate to one of the eventual presidential contenders. Henry Clay from Kentucky, the Speaker of the House, was another guy who got a ton of support. He was very well known publicly. He had engineered the Missouri Compromise. He had a very strong plan and agenda for the American economy. He literally called it the American Plan, that would have internal improvements. It would include tariffs. It would protect slavery. It would protect slave-grown agriculture. So a lot of people were behind Henry Clay. Now, the guy who was probably the single most qualified candidate was John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. Now, he wasn't qualified because he was John Adams' son. He was eminently qualified because he had been a diplomat since the age of 17. He was at this point, pretty much at the high point of a political career that one could get to outside of being the president. John Quincy Adams was the sitting Secretary of State. And during these days, in this particular era, if one wanted to prepare for the presidency, they absolutely wanted nothing to do with the vice president. The vice presidency is not even a member of the cabinet or it's not considered a member of the cabinet during this era. The chief diplomat for the United States, the guy who meets with foreign leaders, the guy who comes up with American foreign policy points, that's the Secretary of State's job. And John Quincy Adams held that position. John Quincy Adams, you should also remember, literally wrote the Monroe Doctrine for President James Monroe and convinced him to put it out there. He had a clear plan for national expansion. He had ideas about the national economy. And again, he's got a very well-known name. So virtually everybody looked at him and said, this guy's probably the most qualified. Now, the one guy I haven't mentioned yet is Andrew Jackson. And the reason is that he's a dark horse in all of this. Nobody has any idea what Andrew Jackson believes. Nobody has any idea whether Jackson even really wants to be the president. But we do know that he was very popular in the American eye because of the Battle of New Orleans. And generals are always very popular. We can look at the previous example of George Washington after the Revolutionary War. We can look to future examples like Zachary Taylor after the war with Mexico, Ulysses S. Grant after the American Civil War, Dwight Eisenhower after World War II. Generals are popular political figures. So lots of people were saying, by God, we got to get Andrew Jackson. He's just the guy to fix this country. So the election actually happens, and Jackson actually wins the popular vote. And I take that back. John Quincy Adams wins the popular vote. However, I'm sorry. I'm wrong about that. I was right the first time. Sorry about that. Jackson wins the popular vote, but he does not win enough in the Electoral College. He wins what's called a plurality, meaning out of all of those candidates, Jackson has more votes than anybody else. But if you take all of these other candidates and you combine their totals are more than what Jackson got. Remember, the Constitution requires a majority in the Electoral College. A president must win 50% plus one in the Electoral College, and Jackson simply did not have that. So again, just like happened in 1800, the election goes to the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives is led by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. And Henry Clay is going to be in charge of running this election. Now, remember how it works. Every state's delegation gets one vote. So a state's congressional delegation has to meet, they vote, and whoever wins that state's delegation vote, they get the state's vote for president. Now, as all of this is happening, Clay announces, kind of suspiciously to everyone, it seems, he announces, I am withdrawing from the race. I don't want this to drag on like it dragged on in 1800, so I am stepping aside. But he also says, and his word carries a lot of weight because he's the Speaker of the House. He says, if you would have supported me, then you should support John Quincy Adams. Now, when the election happens, when the state's delegations begin voting and state after state comes in, John Quincy Adams wins because Henry Clay threw a ton of support to John Quincy Adams. Now, Andrew Jackson is furious about this, and with good reason. Andrew Jackson looks at this and goes, look, I won the popular vote. There's no debate about that. And he says, realistically, I won the Electoral College. I didn't win a majority, but I had more votes than everybody else. So what should have happened, according to Jackson, what should have happened is those state delegations should have gotten together and they should have realized this is the will of the people and they should have voted for me. That they didn't is nothing short of corruption, Jackson charges. And I think he's got a pretty good reason to be angry here. And Jackson claims that he has been, quote, the victim of a corrupt bargain. And even at the start of this, Jackson goes, I don't have the proof. I'm paraphrasing. I don't have the proof, but I'm positive I have been the victim of a corrupt bargain. And it becomes even clearer that Jackson was right about this. That it seems to many people that there was a quid pro quo, a this for that, because Congress elects John Quincy Adams as president, and then when John Quincy Adams puts his cabinet together, he names as his Secretary of State designate Henry Clay. So everybody concludes, well, this is easy. Henry Clay traded running for president for being Secretary of State, which, as you will recall, is the stepping stone position to the presidency. So Andrew Jackson is in a fit of rage over all of this. And Andrew Jackson, to be clear, is not a guy that you want to be aiming a fit of rage at you. Now, while he declares he's been the victim of a corrupt bargain, he doesn't go out and sue anybody or go out and teach at colleges like Al Gore did in 2000 or make a documentary film or anything like that. What he winds up doing is developing a friendship with Martin Van Buren, the same Martin Van Buren who created the Democratic Party, that group of people who are pro-slavery Northerners who are going to support pro-slavery Southerners. Martin Van Buren has looked at Andrew Jackson, and they've got literally nothing in common. But Martin Van Buren likes what Andrew Jackson brings to the table in terms of fiery rhetoric, in terms of support of the people, in terms of the seeming ability to mobilize a lot of people. So Van Buren basically turns over the power of the Democratic Party to Jackson and says, look, I want you to lead the Democratic Party. You can have our apparatus. You can have the newspapers. You can have our political organizers. You can have our vote-getting, quote, machine, if you will. You're going to be in charge. And Andrew Jackson uses this and uses it well. Instead of filing lawsuits, what Jackson does is he spends the next 4 years just hammering away at everything that John Quincy Adams does as president. No matter what John Quincy Adams does, you've got Andrew Jackson there to say, well, that's stupid. I would have done it this way. And again, I'm paraphrasing. It doesn't literally say it that way. But also, to be clear, Jackson wasn't much of a guy for nuance. So it wouldn't have been beyond him to say, that's stupid. Here's how I would have done it. By the time the election of 1828 rolls around, it's John Quincy Adams running for re-election. And the Democratic Party is clearly going to be Andrew Jackson's party. So this one is much less of a crowded field. It is just Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And it showed what these new political parties like the Democratic Party could actually be. Adams is going to attack Jackson over and over and over again during this election. And whether it's John Quincy Adams personally or whether it's John Quincy Adams's campaign, it's irrelevant. It's still the same personalized attack that John Quincy Adams actually saw in his father's election campaign against Thomas Jefferson all the way back in 1800. For example, the Adams people were claiming that Andrew Jackson was illiterate. They called him a bigamist, and the rationale for that was Andrew Jackson had gotten married to a woman who had been married before. And because of what we would today understandably call a clerical error, she wasn't actually legally divorced from her first husband. Now, they weren't willingly committing bigamy. They didn't go out and go, well, yeah, I know I'm married to this other guy, but yeah, I'm going to marry you too, Andrew. That's not how this played out. She legitimately thought she was divorced from her first husband. And of course, when they found out that she wasn't, they fixed the clerical error, but that period where she was technically married to the other guy was something that Adams consistently used against Andrew Jackson. They used all sorts of personal slurs against him. They called him a, quote, slave trader, which was very insulting during this period. Uh, uh, even though we had legalized slavery in the United States, people looked at slave traders as being the very bottom level of society. These were the ugliest people in the world because they were actually profiting from, bringing people into this system. My personal favorite insult is that he was, quote unquote, a backcountry buffoon, which is basically the 19th century way of calling someone an ignorant hillbilly. And then the coup de grace for all of this was that they claimed that Andrew Jackson had personally murdered 9 people in duels. Now, Jackson didn't run away from any of this. He explained the bigamy. He explained the whole issue. He said, basically, I'm proud to be from the back country of Tennessee, and, you can portray me as illiterate and stupid, but I'm not. And he pointed to his military record. And then when it came to this question of the duels, or of the murdering 9 people in duels, Jackson said, they were duels. They were a matter of honor. It was perfectly legal what I did. And by the way, it was 12, not 9. So Jackson's not running away from any of this stuff. And it turns out that in 1828, Jackson does wind up winning, and winning decisively. But in the process, he shows what the point of these new political parties could be. Jackson had turned the Democratic Party into a nationwide organization that was designed for the sole purpose of winning elections, not delineating political differences, not saying, here are the differences between me and John Quincy Adams. It's about a machinery that knows how to go out, gin up support, and get people to the polling place to cast ballots. Now, the way they do this is very simple. Jackson played up his common man image. Jackson had been born in 1767 in a log cabin. So unlike William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson could actually say, no, that's my story. That is my story. And in addition to that, he wound up enlisting in the Continental Army at the age of 13 years of age after his father died and then after he lost his mother. He was taken prisoner during the Revolutionary War, where a British officer slashed Jackson's face because Jackson was mouthing off to him in the prison camp that he was in. And it was a scar that ran basically across the bridge of Jackson's nose and across his cheek. Excuse me. And it was a point of pride to Jackson, something he constantly showed off. So he did all of that stuff before he was out of his teens. And then after the Revolutionary War is over, he wound up getting a bounty from the territory of Tennessee. He moved there. He made a fortune as a planter and owned, as many of these guys that I've talked to you about, owned more than 100 slaves. Now, Jackson knew that you don't build support in these political machines by showing that you're rich. So he played up the idea of his common background and said, yes, I'm rich now, but I know what it's like to be poor. I've been in the same place that all of you guys have been in. I know what it's like to be poor. I know what it's like to pull myself up out of poverty. And he used symbols to demonstrate this. So one way to demonstrate that he hasn't forgotten his roots is when he wins the presidency, he literally invited any American that wanted to come to the White House to celebrate his inauguration. And people showed up in droves to this inauguration. And they party at the White House. It's quite literally a house party at the White House. And they tore up curtains. They destroyed the White House china, they broke windows, they tore wallpaper off of the walls. It got so bad that Andrew Jackson, after 2 weeks of all of this stuff, basically said, "Well, I can't get any work done here," and wound up moving to I want to say it was the Supreme Court's offices, but uh, that may be wrong. But the point is, Jackson actually moved out of the White House to actually get some work done. So that's one thing. He also creates the spoils system of politics in the United States. Now, today, in order to get a job with the government, you have to take a civil service exam to show that you actually have the skills for the job that you're applying for. So, for example, if you're applying for a job in the Congressional Budget Office, you take a civil service exam that shows that you know how budgeting works, how accounting procedures work, that sort of thing. But Jackson looked at this sort of stuff and said, it doesn't take any special skill to run the government. He said any average person with average intelligence can run the government. So he said, I'm going to give jobs in the government to local and loyal party workers. The reason for this is it will help build loyalty within the party by saying, you work for us, you'll get a job. But also, theoretically, this makes the government more responsive to the people. For example, one of those sorts of patronage jobs that he gives away is the postmaster general. And so the point of this is why I say it makes it more responsive to the people is if you don't like the way the mail's being delivered, there's a simple fix for it. Vote these guys out. And when the next election comes around and you voted them out, you'll get a new postmaster general, one who theoretically will know what to do better than the last guy. And if you don't like them, vote them all out and get a whole new group of elected officials and appointed officials. So it builds the party and it makes the party more responsive to the people in the United States. And then the other thing Jackson does to give people more of a say is instead of having these sort of caucuses of congressmen who nominate, what Jackson wants the Democratic Party to have is to have a nominating convention where the party members actually get together, or they'll send delegates to a national convention, and then they will choose the candidates as opposed to a bunch of guys sitting in a back room discussing who will benefit us the most. Now, it's not entirely as democratic. It doesn't ever work out entirely as democratically as Jackson wants, but it's important symbolically because people truly believe they have a bigger say in all of this stuff. Now, Jackson's presidency is kind of predicated on this split within the Democratic Republican Party that creates that Democratic Party. And part of why they're splitting, remember, is over the issue of slavery. And Jackson's presidency, a big part of his presidency, is going to be taken up with issues about slavery, issues that relate to slavery, that, again, when we look at the surface, don't really have a ton to do with the issue of slavery. Andrew Jackson's problem with Indian removal is actually going to show this. After the War of 1812, while Jackson had participated in the removal of thousands of Indians across the Mississippi River, there were still about 100,000 Indians who lived in the eastern parts of the Mississippi River, in places like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, parts of Tennessee. They lived in these areas. In part, they were able to stay because they were allies of the United States during the War of 1812, something that Andrew Jackson was well aware of because, remember, he had fought in the War of 1812. Now, what Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, parts of Tennessee, what all of these areas have in common was that they had land that was potentially valuable for the purposes of growing cotton. And if you remember back to a previous lecture, people who grow cotton believe that they need three things in order to grow cotton. They need land, they need a cotton gin, and they need slaves. Okay? So the connection to this stuff is, the connection to slavery here is who's going to hold on to this land and how will this land be developed? Will the Indians hold on to it, or will Americans get a hold of this land and turn it into cotton plantations that are operated by plantation owners who own hundreds of slaves. Now, the question is not as easy as some might think. Uh, there was a clear understanding that there were lots of Native Americans and that something had to be done about, quote, the Indian problem. But the what to do is where the problem resided. Now, one potential answer, was assimilation. And we see this in the person of a Choctaw Indian named James McDonald, who would be a grand experiment for Indian supporters in the United States. He had been raised by American missionaries who wanted to prove that Native Americans could be raised and educated to live, quote unquote, just like white people. So these missionaries actually got a hold of McDonald at a very young age. They raised him, they took him to schools. He wound up learning Greek and Latin. He had a very traditional education for the era. He wound up being sent to college and then being sent to study the law with a justice of the Supreme Court. So not only is he studying the law, which is sort of the quintessential upper class profession, he's getting the best education a person could get in the law by clerking and studying with a Supreme Court justice. Now, McDonald becomes very successful in all of this. He makes it through school, makes it through college, makes it through his legal studies, but he also winds up having a ton of identity issues because the white community, as much as McDonald does to try to assimilate, the white community looks at him as almost a sideshow. They don't really take him seriously, and they certainly don't allow him in, if you will. And as far as other Native Americans, they look at him as somebody who has sold out his heritage, who has turned his back on his people. So he not only doesn't fit in with the whites who he's trying to assimilate to, he doesn't fit in with his own people either. And McDonald developed a very big alcohol problem and ultimately wound up committing suicide. This convinced a lot of advocates, and it convinced Andrew Jackson as well, that assimilation was not a possibility. It simply would not work. So Jackson had to come up with another way, and what Jackson believed was that ultimately, in order to save the Indians, quote unquote, their only chance for survival was to be removed from, quote, American society, and you can read that as be removed from white society, and pushed across the Mississippi River, where they would live in an area reserved to them in perpetuity, as Jackson put it. Now, as much as Jackson and a lot of these advocates were claiming, quote, assimilation didn't work, just look at James McDonald, there was an example of assimilation working and working very well, and that was in the Cherokee people in the United States. There was a Cherokee leader named John Ross, and he had fought during the War of 1812. He had become exceptionally well educated, and during the War of 1812, he saw the might of the United States up close. He was fighting alongside Andrew Jackson because the Cherokee and Creek Indians were traditional rivals, and so he saw this as a politically expedient move to side with the United States. And he became convinced after the War of 1812 that the only chance for Cherokee survival was through assimilation. That's the only way they can remain independent. So Ross not only educated himself, but he became committed to getting some sense of education for the rest of the Cherokee people. He wound up getting together with the leaders of the Cherokee Nation, getting them to develop a written language out of their oral tradition. They did not have a written language at the start of all this, but Ross and all of these elders and intellectual leaders developed this written language. When they do this, they create an alphabet so that they can teach this to their younger generations. They write a constitution for the purpose of governance of all Cherokee. You can probably figure out which constitution they use as a model for their constitution. They develop a system of public schools that they operate as a way of getting all of this ingrained to the Cherokee children. They start growing cotton on their lands. They adopt the use of cotton gins, and even as one more measure of saying that these people are assimilating into, quote, what is American during this period, the Cherokee even begin buying and owning slaves during this period. So, by every standard of what white America was practicing, the Cherokee were, quote, civilizing and assimilating. There's no question about this. However, Georgia actually wanted the land that the Cherokee controlled, and they simply decided they were going to seize it. They passed an Indian Relocation Act and planned on seizing the land. And Ross said, "We're fighting back. We're not going to accept this. We're going to take all of this. We're not going to take this. We're going to take our case, and we're gonna win." But this idea of we're going to take our case is the important phrase here. He doesn't go out and fight the traditional way. What Ross winds up doing is filing a lawsuit against the United States. And in the case, Worcester versus Georgia, the Cherokee actually sue the Georgia government, saying that what Georgia is doing violates the treaties that they actually have with the United States government. And they cannot do this. They can't actually force the Cherokee to move the way they're doing. The United States Supreme Court winds up getting this case, and what the court ruled in this case is that the treaties had been arranged between the Cherokee and the United States government. The supremacy clause of the United States Constitution meant that Georgia simply could not just take those treaties and throw them out, no matter how much they wanted it. They could not do that. And they further ruled that the U.S. government is obligated to protect the Cherokee against these advances from the people in Georgia. Now, Jackson says about this whole thing that Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it, as a way of saying that, yeah, the Supreme Court can say whatever they want, but, I am the guy who's in charge of the executive branch, and I have no intention of actually enforcing this. Now, while Jackson does not specifically move to violate what the court has ordered in all of this, what Jackson does do is he goes around John Ross. He goes and starts talking to lesser leaders within the Cherokee people, within the Cherokee tribes, and he gets them to agree to a deal. They will take $5 million in return for moving all Cherokee to the area across the Mississippi River. So he basically bribes these people, and it winds up becoming the famous Trail of Tears that winds up leading to this mass exodus of Cherokee from the east to the area across the Mississippi River. Now, where these people are going, they're going into an area that's going to be literally called, quote, Indian Territory, which is in present day Oklahoma. And if any of you have been watching the news, you know that there was a recent Supreme Court case that said that basically the eastern half of Oklahoma actually belongs to these Indians. So all of these groups still theoretically still control this area. Now, according to the treaty that winds up getting signed, courtesy of a new Indian Removal Act that Jackson winds up signing, the Cherokee are to be removed, and they're going to move via the auspices of the United States Army, meaning the Army is going to be in charge of moving them. Part of this meant that the United States was going to provide transportation for the Indians. And the portrayal of it on our screen here with this painting notwithstanding, the Army had actually contracted out the transportation. And the contractor actually defaulted on all of this. So rather than having the wagons and the horses and all of this to move 16,000 Cherokee literally across the country, many of the bulk of these people were actually forced to move on foot. They were not moving in wagons or on horseback. And of course, given how arduous it would be, I mean, just imagine moving on foot with all of your possessions from Georgia to Oklahoma. That's a huge distance. A quarter of the population, 25%, of the Cherokee population died along the way of this trail, the so-called Trail of Tears. Other Indians were forced out as well. Choctaw Indians, Chickasaws, the few remaining Creeks in the east. These groups all also had their own Trail of Tears. Now, in challenge to all of this, some Indians thought that using the courts was not worth the hassle. Negotiation with the United States is not worth the hassle. Resistance is their only option. And Seminoles in Florida believed this to be the case. They were led by a chief named Osceola, and he fought one of the longest wars in American history. It only ended when the United States invited him, U.S. officials invited him to a peace conference and then kidnapped him, with Osceola dying in U.S. military custody. Now, there's a lot of supposition that Osceola was murdered, and many historians still argue that Osceola was murdered. There is some evidence to suggest that he may have contracted cholera or smallpox, and that's what killed him. But consensus right now is that Osceola was murdered. Either way, whether he was murdered or whether he contracted cholera or smallpox or whatever is almost irrelevant. The way the Seminole saw this was our leader went into this peace conference and never came back. So they were clearly going to fight back against the United States. Pacifying the Seminole cost the United States $20 million, or to adjust it for inflation, it would have cost about $420 million in today's currency. But I think a better comparison for how the cost of this played out is that a couple of classes back, I talked about how the United States actually acquired Florida. And I mentioned that John Quincy Adams had given an ultimatum to the Spanish government. And it culminated in a payment for Florida. The United States paid $15 million for Florida back in 1820 or 1821, I think it is. And here we are now in the 1830s, and they have to spend another $20 million to fight Seminole control in India or in Florida, and continue to be in order to continue to claim dominion over Florida. So it's a really remarkable, expensive, and ugly circumstance that the United States fights in Florida. But this is sort of the high point, if you will, of removal. And Indians are given two choices in this removal scheme, if you will. They were told, you either become a private property owning farming family, which essentially means abandon your tribe, live like, quote unquote, like white people, or you move to the West. Now, most Native Americans didn't have have a concept of private property. It's not like it was beyond their understanding, but they just kind of looked at it and said, I don't understand how a person can own land. When you die, you can't take that land with you. So how can you possibly own it? Okay, it's not something that a person can possess. So given this lack of the concept of private property, most chose the second option to move west. There were a few who chose option number one. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. There were many who chose option number one, but because of that lack of a concept of private property, many got swindled out of their property and became just mired in dire poverty. Now, when Jackson signed these orders and allowed them, or forced them, I shouldn't say allowed them, forced them to move west, Jackson promised this land, quote unquote, in perpetuity. But it was also pretty clear that in perpetuity didn't really mean forever, because Jackson dies in 1845, and before he died, the United States was already moving to get rid of that promise of, quote, in perpetuity. It turned out that people after Jackson's presidency discovered that the land was too productive in the West, that the resource base in terms of mineral wealth, in terms of copper, gold, silver, stuff like that, those mineral resources were too great, And the United States would embark on a new policy beginning in the 1840s and 1850s called concentration or the reservation policy. So, what are we to make of all of this? Again, the United States we claim that our history is different, that we're not like other countries. Uh, but before I talk about that, I want to mention very briefly that Jackson always argued that everything that he did was done legitimately, that there were always treaties that were signed, so everything was legal. And that's true, but the treaties, you can also probably figure, were almost always signed under duress. But why I mentioned this issue about the uniqueness of American history is that at the same time that the United States is moving to push Indians across the Mississippi River into this quote permanent Indian reservation, at the same time Great Britain's government is heading into the outback in Australia and starting to exterminate Aborigines there. In New Zealand, the British are lining up and marching across the back country there and killing every Maori that they come into contact with. In South Africa, the Dutch, a group of people called the Boers, are pushing Zulu off of their land. In Argentina, people are moving into the Pampas region and exterminating Argentinian Indians. In Russia, troops of the Tsar are marching into the steppes region of Eurasia, and they're starting their first efforts to try to eliminate people who we today refer to as the Chechens. So the process that's happening in the United States is being mirrored all across the Western world. You've got people who represent quote unquote Western civilization, whatever that is, and they're essentially attacking nomadic indigenous peoples and exterminating or moving them in virtually every other part of the world. Now, this was the end of Lecture 13, American Democracy. So this takes you to Exam 2. So everything that you deal with after this, starting with Lecture 14 forward, is all stuff that moves toward the final exam. So good luck with examination number 2, and I'll see you next time for Lecture 14.